do you think started it? The war?
Albert Einstein.
You're kidding.
On the Beach is the film that looked the Cold War directly in the eye and refused to blink. No explosions, no heroes, no last-minute escape, just the end of the world arriving on schedule while people danced and waited. But the version you saw almost never existed. Did you know the U.S. Navy refused to cooperate because the film scared them too much? Or that the famous Ava Gardner quote about Melbourne was invented by a journalist and she never said it at all? Today we're uncovering 15 hidden truths about On the Beach, 1959. 1. The U.S. Navy refused to cooperate because the film was too convincing. Stanley Kramer needed a nuclear submarine at the center of his story. He went to the United States Department of Defense and the U.S. Navy and made the request formally. They said no. The Navy declined to cooperate in any aspect of the production. No access to vessels, no technical consultation, no support of any kind. The reason was not logistical, it was political. The film depicted nuclear war ending all human life, and the Navy had no interest in lending its equipment and credibility to a story that said the weapons their submarines carried would eventually kill everyone on Earth. A film that took nuclear annihilation seriously as an outcome was not something the American military wanted to be associated with. Kramer was forced to use HMS Andrews, a British Royal Navy diesel-electric submarine, painted with the hull numbers 623 to pass as an American vessel. The U.S. Navy's refusal to participate gave the film an accidental authenticity. The production had to find its own way on location in Australia with no military establishment behind it. 2. The world premiere happened simultaneously in 18 cities, including Moscow. Kramer understood that On the Beach was not just a film, it was an argument. And an argument only works if enough people hear it at once. He scheduled the world premiere for December 17, 1959, not in one city, but in 18 capital cities simultaneously across multiple continents: London, Paris, Berlin, Stockholm, Tokyo, Caracas, New York. Heads of state attended many screenings. The stars were dispatched individually across the globe. Ava Gardner to Madrid, Gregory Peck and his wife to Moscow. In Moscow, 1,200 Soviet officials and apparatchiks watched the film together. It was the first time an American film had ever had a premiere on Soviet soil. The film was not commercially released in the USSR, but the screening happened in the capital with an audience of government figures watching American actors portray the end of the world that American and Soviet weapons would bring about. Kramer later said the coordinated premiere helped push the United Nations toward considering formal disarmament talks. Whether that's provable or not, the gesture was unprecedented in the history of cinema. 3. The author called the film a bastardization of his work, and said so publicly. Neville Shute had written On the Beach in 1957 as a precise, controlled, deeply Australian novel. He sold the film rights for $100,000. What he got back was not what he expected. Shute called the finished film a bastardization. He had specific objections. The relationship between Commander Towers and Moira Davidson in the novel is unconsummated. Towers remains faithful to his wife and family, whom he knows are dead in Connecticut. He refuses to betray them even at the end of the world. Kramer turned it into a conventional love affair. Shute found that change a fundamental betrayal of the story's moral core. He also objected that the film soft-pedaled what radiation sickness actually does to a human body. The novel does not spare those details. Radiation kills slowly and grotesquely: nausea, hair loss, skin destruction, organ failure, a long and agonizing process. The film, Shute argued, allowed audiences to look away from the true horror of what nuclear weapons would actually mean for the bodies of the people who survived the blast. 4. Gregory Peck agreed with the author, and Kramer overruled them both. Shute was not alone in his objection to the consummated love affair. Gregory Peck, who played Towers, also believed the character should remain faithful to his dead wife and family throughout the film. He argued the case directly to Kramer. Peck's position was that fidelity was the entire emotional architecture of Towers as a character, a man who maintains loyalty to people he knows are dead. who refuses to emotionally abandon them even when survival and a new life are available, is a fundamentally different kind of hero than the genre was used to. It was the most interesting thing about the character. Making him simply fall in love with Moira reduced him to a conventional romantic lead. Kramer overruled them both. He wanted the love story because he believed audiences needed an emotional anchor beyond the abstract horror of extinction. He may have been commercially correct. Whether he was artistically correct has been debated by critics ever since the film opened. The version that exists is the version Peck and Schutte both said shouldn't. 5. Fred Astaire was cast because of his wife's suggestion while watching television. Kramer had been struggling to cast the role of Julian Osborne, a cynical, fatalistic scientist who has given up on everything and decided to spend the end of the world racing cars and drinking. None of the dramatic actors he was considering felt right. He couldn't find the quality he needed. His wife was watching television one evening and saw Fred Astaire on screen. She turned to Kramer and said, "Him? That's Julian." Astaire was 59 years old. He had spent his entire career as a dancer and light comedian. He had never played a dramatic role. Kramer called him and offered it. Astaire accepted and delivered what many critics considered the most surprising performance in the film. A man whose charm and lightness had been stripped away, leaving only a quiet, grieving intelligence waiting for the end. The Golden Globe-nominated turn that helped launch the second chapter of Astaire's career came from his director's wife watching TV and pointing at the screen. 6, the famous Ava Gardner quote about Melbourne was invented by a journalist. One of the most repeated stories about On the Beach is the quote attributed to Ava Gardner on her arrival in Melbourne. She supposedly looked around the city and said it was the perfect place to film a movie about the end of the world. She never said it. The quote was invented by Neil Gillett, a journalist for the Sydney Morning Herald, as a satirical piece of invention. He made it up. There is no record of Gardner saying it in any interview, in any contemporary account, or in her own autobiography. The fabricated quote has been repeated for 60 years as documented fact. It appears in film histories, in encyclopedias of cinema, in countless reviews and retrospectives. It is the single most famous thing associated with the production of On the Beach in Australia. Gardner visited Melbourne for months during filming, was surrounded by press at every turn, and the most memorable thing anyone believes she said there is something she never actually said. The journalist who invented it died with that distinction largely uncredited. 7. The Navy agreed to the film, but only after the production moved to Australia. While the U.S. Navy refused to cooperate, Kramer found a different kind of military support in Australia. The Australian government and the Royal Australian Navy agreed to participate in the production. Australian naval vessels, personnel, and facilities were made available to the production in Melbourne. The cooperation gave the film a level of authenticity that the American military's refusal would otherwise have made impossible. Real naval personnel appear in background roles throughout. The dockside sequences were filmed at actual naval facilities. The presence of real military infrastructure around the story's fictional submarine made the world of the film feel genuinely inhabited rather than constructed. The Australian support also reflected something about the film's reception. Australia was not a nuclear power. It had no missiles to defend, no military doctrine to protect. A film about nuclear war killing everyone on Earth was for Australians a story about being killed by weapons they had no say in developing or deploying. The Australian government's willingness to assist was a different kind of political statement than the American military's refusal. Anyhow, the mysterious radio signal in San Diego came from a window shade hitting a telegraph key. One of the film's most haunting sequences involves the submarine traveling to San Diego to investigate unexplained radio signals coming from the dead city. It suggests briefly that someone may have survived in the Northern Hemisphere. The crew allows itself to hope. The signal turns out to be an accident, like a window shade caught by the wind repeatedly striking a telegraph key in an abandoned building. No one is alive. The signals were never a message. They were just wind-moving cloth against metal in a dead city. The crew returns to Australia with that knowledge. Kramer held that sequence, the discovery, the silence, the return, As an example of what the film could do that most disaster cinema couldn't, the horror isn't in the explosion or the monster, it's in the empty street. It's in the realization that the signal you traveled thousands of miles to find was never meant for anyone. The world had ended and kept making noise anyway. 9. The crowds of Melbourne locals kept walking into camera frame, filming on location in Melbourne, created logistical problems that no studio set could have anticipated. Thousands of bathers gathered in shoulder-deep water during beach sequences just to watch the production. They applauded the cast after every take. The problem was, they wouldn't stop moving forward as soon as a crowd of local onlookers gathered near Ava Gardner. They surged toward her, not maliciously, just with the enthusiasm of people who had never been this close to a Hollywood star before. They walked directly into the camera frame repeatedly. Sequences that should have taken a morning took all day because every setup was interrupted by Melburnians edging into shot. The suburb of Berwick, where part of the film was shot, later named streets after the production's major figures: Gardner Street, Chute Avenue, Kramer Drive. A film about the end of humanity left a small piece of suburban Melbourne permanently renamed after the people who came to film its extinction. 10. The title came from a T.S. Eliot poem written in 1925. The title On the Beach was not taken from a geographical description or a simple evocation of the Australian setting. It comes from a line in The Hollow Men, a 1925 poem by T.S. Eliot. The poem's final section includes the image of being gathered on the beach of the Tumid River, a purgatorial shore where figures wait between life and death, unable to cross. Neville Shute chose that reference deliberately when he titled his novel. The hollow men of Eliot's poem are souls who cannot commit, who exist in a permanent state of waiting, neither alive nor dead, neither in the world nor out of it. The survivors in Melbourne are exactly that. They have not yet died. The world they knew is already gone. They are on the beach between those two states. The phrase ends with Eliot's most famous lines, not with a bang, but a whimper. A novel and then a film that shows the literal end of the human race built its entire title on that image. The ending Eliot described as a whimper was the ending Kramer put on screen. 11. The production paid guards to stop traffic on the Golden Gate Bridge. One of the film's most eerie images is the Golden Gate Bridge, and one of the most recognizable landmarks in America. Completely empty, no cars, no people. A structure designed for the movement of thousands, reduced to a silent monument to a civilization that no longer exists. Getting that shot required stopping traffic on one of the busiest crossings in California. According to production accounts, guards at each end of the bridge were reportedly paid $500 each to hold cars for approximately 1 minute, enough time for the camera to capture the empty span before the queue of waiting vehicles could be released. The resulting image lasts only seconds in the finished film. It cost money and coordination to achieve, required the cooperation of strangers, and was impossible to repeat. It is one of the most effective shots in the film precisely because audiences know what the Golden Gate Bridge is supposed to look like. Emptiness on that structure doesn't read as a quiet day. It reads as the end of everything. 12. The score won the Golden Globe. Built almost entirely on one folk song, Ernest Gold composed the score for On the Beach and won the Golden Globe for Best Original Score. The Academy Award nomination followed. The score was built around a single source material, the Australian bush ballad Waltzing Matilda, written around 1895. Gold took that melody and put it through every emotional register the film required. It opens the film as a gentle, distant thing, almost nostalgic. It accompanies the submarine's voyage as something melancholy and searching. By the film's final sequences, it has become something closer to a dirge, a civilization's last song playing over the quiet streets of a city that will shortly be empty. Some critics felt he overdid it, that the repetition of one melody across 2 hours was too insistent. Others argued that the repetition was precisely the point. A world ending with the same song playing over and over is not a failure of imagination. It is what the end of the world would actually sound like, the same things again and again until they stop. 13. Anthony Perkins spent the entire production struggling with an Australian accent. Anthony Perkins was cast as Lieutenant Peter Holmes, an Australian naval officer navigating the end of the world with a young wife and a newborn baby. He was 27 years old, American, and had never played a character with a regional Australian accent before. He worked on it throughout the production. He worked on it with coaches. He did not entirely succeed. Critics at the time noted the inconsistency in his accent, the way it slipped in and out depending on the emotional intensity of the scene, with the American underneath surfacing at moments of stress or quietness. What Perkins did succeed at was the emotional core of the character. Holmes is an ordinary man in an impossible situation, a young father who has to decide whether to give his wife and infant daughter suicide pills before the radiation arrives, so they don't suffer the slow death that's coming anyway. It's one of the film's most devastating performances. Nobody reviewing the film in December 1959 spent much time on the accent problem. 14. The film lost money despite critical acclaim and global political impact. On the Beach cost $2.9 million to produce. It earned $2.2 million at the box office. A film that premiered simultaneously in 18 world capitals, screened for 1,200 Soviet officials in Moscow, influenced United Nations disarmament conversations, and received Academy Award nominations for its score, and editing did not make back its production budget. Part of the reason was timing. By December 1959, the immediate Cold War tension of the early and mid-1950s had temporarily eased. Nikita Khrushchev had visited President Eisenhower at Camp David in September. U.S.-Soviet relations were in a period of cautious thaw. A film about nuclear annihilation as an inevitable outcome landed in a moment when audiences were allowing themselves to believe the worst might be avoided. Had it opened in 1953 or in 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis reminded the world exactly how close the edge was, its reception might have been entirely different. Great films are always in conversation with the moment they open. On the Beach arrived at precisely the wrong moment and remained important anyway. 15. The film is credited with influencing the nuclear disarmament movement of the 1960s. On the Beach did not start the anti-nuclear movement, but it gave it something it had been struggling to find: a human story that made the abstract threat of nuclear war feel immediate and personal and inevitable. Before the film, most nuclear anxiety existed in the language of policy, strategy, and deterrence. Megatons, kill radii, civil defense procedures, the language of military planning. On the Beach translated all of that into something else entirely. Two people in Melbourne trying to decide whether to spend their last months together, a scientist choosing to die in a racing car rather than wait for radiation to take him, a young mother asking whether to give her baby a lethal pill. On the Beach asked one question, not whether the bomb would fall, but what you'd do in the quiet months before it arrived. What would you choose? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this one stayed with you, subscribe. There's a lot more waiting in the films that said what nobody else wanted to say.